Okay, here is our guest, Elaine Donnelly. Why don't we just get started by telling us about the Center for Military Readiness? I understand you founded it.
Yes.
What was going on with you? What is your background that caused you to take an interest in this and choose to start this organization?
Well, I founded the Center for Military Readiness as a public policy organization in 1993. That was the year after my term as a member of the Presidential Commission on the Assignment of Women in the Armed Forces. The Presidential Commission studied the issue of women in combat for a full year. And at the end of that, I realized there was no organization that was following the issues, the military social issues, full time. At that time, or prior to that, women in combat was, of course, and still is, a hot button issue. Question of whether young women should be subject to selective service registration, possible future draft. And in 1993, that was Bill Clinton's administration, and the big push was gays in the military. So we began having conferences and did a lot of research on it. As a result, a law was passed that did withstand constitutional scrutiny for quite a few years, decades actually, until Barack Obama came along. And of course, Barack Obama changed that. He got Congress convinced that was a good idea. Many of the promises they made were made to be broken. And that was in 2010. So we've been following military social issues for well over 25 years. And it's a very busy uh, agenda to stay on top of, especially now with the new administration. There's several issues of concern, including a new one, critical race theory instructions in our military, starting with the military service academies.
Yeah, so I want to before we get before we get ahead of ourselves, I'm going to tick through all those. I've got kind of the hot button issues here all
Okay.
set to go, but just back to you, so people have your background. I mean, were you in the military? What was it
No,
that drew you to this issue originally?
no, I was not in the military, and that may sound like a disadvantage. It's actually just the opposite, because quite often I do call out 3 and 4 star generals, admirals, Pentagon leaders. I can say things that if I had been in the military, I wouldn't be able to say because rank gets in the way. Just as we see with civilian women feminists, they're always sounding off, making demands. They know nothing about the military. The difference between them and me is I do follow the advice of people whose status in the military I respect. 3 and 4 star generals and admirals who know what they're talking about, who have their priorities correct. And when I founded my organization, many of them were and still are mentors and good friends. I go to them for advice. So, as a civilian woman, I have the freedom to write about military social issues. I'm not limited by rank considerations. And I do so, though, with the help of people who have served many years in the military, and I take their advice very seriously.
Yeah, well, we do have a civilian military, right? The president is the commander in chief, and he is a civilian. And
But
then
as a matter of fact, it's a point worth mentioning because we have civilian control of the military. It's up to civilians, people like you and me, to oversee what happens. That means overseeing Congress. It means going to Congress when necessary and say, look, this isn't right. You need to support our troops by enacting sound policy and not allowing Pentagon leaders to make such serious mistakes that it actually hurts men and women in the military and detracts from readiness.
yeah, although as we dig into the issues, I think we'll probably learn that civilian control of our military actually has been the problem because you've got
It is.
civilians wanting to do social experiments in the military. And if it was simply left to generals with no politics involved and their focus was solely on winning wars, we probably wouldn't be having these social experiments.
That too is a point well worth making. The military is resilient. It does respond to orders. Now, those orders can be good orders, sound policy, or they can be bad orders. That's what we're seeing right now. When we see a Secretary of Defense right now who is mandating critical race theory instructions in the military, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff defending critical race theory. When we see all of these things happening, it's because the administration not only tolerates it, it's been encouraging it. So, yes, the military is subject to political control, but it should remain non political. Now, that's a very fine line. It's something to work for. The military should not be pushed and pulled and changed every year depending on who's in the White House. But in recent years, that problem not only has it existed, it's gotten worse. And what we're trying to do is, well, all we're saying is we need sound policies that encourage readiness, morale, sound policy, not the kinds of social experiments that hurt men and women in uniform and that detract from readiness.
Yeah. Okay. So before we tick through some of the hot button issues that you guys are working on right now, last question involving you. So what was it that brought you in issue? What was your background, or what intrigued you about it, or caused you to get involved in this issue to begin with, since you weren't in the military?
Well, prior to that, I've always been involved in public policy. The Equal Rights Amendment debate caught my eye because of the issue of selective service, registering and drafting young women. Being the mother of two daughters, that caught my attention. When I was appointed to the Presidential Commission, it was after an appointment to the Defense Advisory Committee on Women in the Services. That was in the Reagan administration. And during those 3 years, I became familiar with the politics of the Pentagon. And what I saw was that people in uniform are not free to go against feminists on anything. Quite often at meetings, they would come around after the meeting and say, you know, that question that you asked, here's the real answer. And I would ask them, well, why didn't you say that at the meeting? And they'd say, because Navy Times was there. That would ruin my career. So fast forward to the 1992 Presidential Commission. I realized there was no organization that would not only raise these issues, but question what is happening, report, analyze military social issues. It all started in the Reagan administration, but it's been a wonderful world to have insight into. Not too many civilians, much less civilian women, have had access to the military in ways that I have. So I wanted to use the benefit of that exposure in a way that would support the troops in this field of public policy. So we're the only organization that does this full time, although we have many allies. CMR is unique, and I hope that people will support us because we are really busy right now.
So there was this big push, and you could tell me when it kind of started, and this is perhaps the beginning of wokeness in the military, but this big push to advance women, right? That
Yeah.
you know, to start putting women in combat, possibly start drafting women. When would you say this whole movement began, and what do you attribute it to?
It really gathered steam in the 1990s. Actually, before that, in the Jimmy Carter administration, that was the first time that the issue of including women in selective service came up. I was there. I was watching when it happened, and I was curious to know why was this happening. This is just before I got appointed to the Defense Advisory Committee on Women in the Services. I wanted to find out what was going on. I had been active in the Reagan campaign. I was a volunteer. So it was a kind of because of that involvement that I was appointed to the Pentagon Advisory Committee. And as I say, at that time, that committee was not as radical as it became in later years. But I was intrigued by the unique culture of the armed forces where everybody has to follow orders. That's why it is so vulnerable to social engineering. If you have a bad administration in the White House, it directly affects the Pentagon, and it affects our men and women in uniform. So at one issue after another, I've seen these things come down the road, and we try to stay on top of all of them.
And would you say it really emanates from the women's, equality movement, where ERA, et cetera, and women, everything must be equal between men and women. So they're out there. There's the equality police looking around society to see ways in which women are treated differently than men, and just assume that in any circumstance that must be bad, it must be corrected. So military clearly was treating men and women differently,
right?
Arguably for very good reasons, you would say, but they don't care about that. They see women not being treated the same. You must treat them exactly the same, irrespective of what the objective is.
Well, I support women in the military. And when I was a member of the DACOITS, I wrote a number of recommendations that did become law later on that supported women in the military. Some of those rules, it was okay if they were taken away. But I do draw this very fine distinction, and it's important to understand the word combat. Women serve in harm's way. They are volunteers. They are not assigned, however, to units that directly attack the enemy. The infantry, special operations forces, units that engage in deliberate offensive action are different than the experience of being in danger, being in harm's way. So it's an important distinction. Now, when the pressure started, beginning with the, I guess it was Bill Clinton's administration, to put women into those combat units, the Pentagon, I think they were not eager to go that far. For a while there, the Pentagon and CMR, we were on the same page. Some exceptions, they were supporting, we supported the infantry, special operations forces, and the like. But then incremental changes started advancing. And when in 2013, the announcement was made that there would not be any exceptions for women in the infantry or anywhere else, the Marine Corps called for a study. They initiated a 3-year study. They had the option to ask for exceptions. That was the most comprehensive study ever done, and probably ever will be done in history, of what it would mean to have women in direct ground combat units. But at the end of the study, when the Marines asked for exceptions, the Bill Clinton administration just said, sorry, excuse me, the Obama administration said, no, we're going to go ahead with this anyway. And so all the rules were taken away, all the exemptions that women had from direct ground combat. And everyone had to salute and say, aye, aye, sir, we're going to make it happen. Well, guess what? It hasn't been working out very well. The gender neutral standards that we were promised would happen, that many members of Congress expected to happen, it's not working out, because the failure rates, when you have gender neutral tests for women starting out at 84% failure rate for women compared to 30% for the men, well, the feminists in Congress say, well, that's not fair. Well, it's a reflection of physical realities. So they've made adjustments, they've changed the terms, they're trying to disguise physical disparities by saying, well, we'll compare the top 5% of women to the top 5% of men. Well, that's not going to work. You can disguise the physical differences that the Marine Corps study confirmed, but it's not going to change what happens on the battlefield. In fact, there would be more casualties, both men and women, if you try to pretend that men and women are exactly the same when they're not. And you try to treat women or train them as if they were men, you wind up with women becoming injured far more frequently than men, debilitating injuries that change their lives. This kind of thing is not acceptable. And if you lower standards to accommodate the women and gender quotas, the quotas are pushing for 25% women in the Navy. They want 1 in 4 women on every Navy ship to be a woman. If you start going with gender quotas, then you have to lower those standards, and that endangers the men as well as the women. It's not good for our military.
So bottom line, just so everyone understands, because I don't really know, the current status of our military is that women can serve in combat, absolute frontline, as frontline as you can get, in combat, right?
Right now, that is the new rule that was enforced by the Obama administration over the objections of the Marine Corps. That is the policy right now. Yeah.
But to be clear, they must pass the same physical tests as men in order to serve in that role. Is that correct?
That's the part that's not working out, because the Army has something called the Army Combat Fitness Test. It's supposed to be gender neutral. It's a tough test, but the women are failing at rates far greater than the men. And it makes it difficult then to meet those gender diversity quotas, 25%. That's where reality is colliding with theory.
So do you feel that they are changing the tests?
They are changing the way the tests are perceived. It still is remaining a tough test. They did make adjustments. For instance, some people can do a plank instead of having to pull their knees up. A leg tuck is what they call it. There were adjustments that were made. This is still a work in progress.
Yeah, I just read that caught my attention, because that hit the news a few weeks ago. Yes. That instead of push-ups, I thought it was instead of push-ups, you could do plank.
Right. Exactly.
And that struck me as a very woke exercise. Right. But is that something that you think is being implemented so that it's easier for women?
Of course, but they won't say it that way. We know that in boot camp, female trainees could not do as many pull-ups as the men, nowhere near as many pull-ups as men. So they adjusted the scoring system so that 3 pull-ups, if a woman can do them, is the same as a man doing 20. This is called gender norming. There are so many different forms of gender norming, it's impossible to discuss in one program. But sometimes it involves changing the scoring system, taking the top 5%, as I mentioned before, percentile comparison, or it means taking out of the regimen the toughest tests. The Marines, even the Marines did this with the infantry combat test, the ICT, very tough test. But they took some of the marching requirements out, or they changed the scoring systems. Again, we've been writing about these issues for years, but the officials in the Pentagon rarely admit that they're doing it so that they can accommodate those gender quotas.
Mhm.
And the pressure for those come from that Pentagon Advisory Committee that I used to belong to back in the 1980s. And it also comes from feminists in Congress, people like Jackie Spear, who chairs the Personnel Subcommittee in the House Armed Services Committee. They always keep pressing, saying this isn't fair, this isn't right. What they don't do is acknowledge how many of the problems women are experiencing today are a direct result of their recommendations. Now, if you want to talk about sexual misconduct of both kinds, voluntary and involuntary, this is a result that we have tracked for years. Pentagon data shows the problem is getting worse, not better. All kinds of issues that the feminists are responsible for, they never admit that they had anything to do with it. But it is a problem when people in the Pentagon don't stand up to it.
Yeah. So this issue has been going on for decades, but it's really just gotten worse, right? I mean,
Yes.
despite all of your good work, you're losing the battle at this
Well,
point.
one exception was in the Trump administration. President Trump did make adjustments in the transgender policy. The Trump policy was not a ban on transgenders in the military.
Well, let's hold on transgender because I want to cover that, but let's just stay on women for a bit, and I'll just share anecdotally information that I have from a brother-in-law who's in the Navy, and he was working at a recruitment facility, and he said absolutely positively, I'm not sure he would call it quotas, but they were giving special treatment to women in recruitment. If a woman walked through the door, they're basically filling out the application for them. If a man walks through the door, they're throwing the application at them. Number one. Number two, he was up for some promotion, and I'm just going to lump things together because I don't remember the details, but basically there's about 80 people up for this promotion that 15 people would qualify for. Of the 15 that got the promotion, he was not one, he's a white male. 14 out of 15 were women or minorities. 14 out of 15 that got the promotion. So that's just 2 anecdotes, but I'm sure you would say, Jim,
that is completely credible. That is exactly how gender diversity metrics quotas work. These mandates are coming straight from the top. And even during the Trump administration, the officials in the Pentagon who were allowed to stay beyond the Obama administration, they kept pushing for those kinds of gender diversity quotas. There is in the Pentagon a huge infrastructure of diversity panels. There's panels, there's commissions, they have meetings all the time. They are more active now than ever, but it still isn't enough. Now we've got diversity, inclusion, and equity, DIE, an acronym that many people say, yeah, the DIE policies that are getting worse.
They say, and I got this quote from off of your website, but they say that diversity is a strategic imperative.
Show me
what is there? Well, first make the argument for them and then give the counter. What is their? Tell me what they say. What is their argument as to why diversity is a strategic imperative?
The closest thing to an argument, and believe me, I have searched to find something to back up that statement, which has been made for quite a few years now. The closest thing that they cite was a study done in business involving investors, I think, stock investors. And someone said if you have a group that includes women, you have a better decision-making process. Again, it's nothing to do with the military. And the data has nothing at all to do with what we're seeing implemented in our military today. Other than that, there is nothing to back up that statement. I hasten to add this. The military is diverse, and that is a good thing. I have always considered diversity to be a good thing. What I object to is the kind of policy that says that skin color matters more than anything else. If merit is the primary issue, meritocracy, you will have if diversity is the primary criterion, you will have diversity naturally, because the best will rise to the top. And that's what we support. This is what we want to see. It's the artificial percentage-based diversity mandates that I object to. And I'll tell you exactly where this problem began. In 2011, there was something called the Military Leadership Diversity Commission. On this commission was the future Commandant of the Marine Corps, General Neller. He was, I think, a two-star at the time. This MLDC, Leadership Diversity Commission, said that what we're going to enforce is not like the civil rights principles of before, not what Harry Truman mandated when military was ahead of the civilian world in saying we're going to end discrimination. When they ended discrimination, it was done for two reasons. The number one reason was not diversity, it was because of the needs of the military. We needed minority soldiers in the time of Korea and every time since then. But MLDC admitted that what they were promoting was percentage-based, that it would be diversity determined by diversity officers in the Pentagon. People would be promoted only if they would support this concept. That's where it began. That MLDC report is still being quoted today. It was a blueprint. And because I followed it, I analyzed it at the time, we're seeing the results, 10 years later. But it's been relentless and incremental. Could it be turned back? Yes, it could. But it would take a new president, it would take a new Congress, and it would take a lot of work by a lot of civilians, a lot of voters to say, we don't want our military to be used for social experiments.
Let me give you an idea, and I think I mentioned this on my show before when I was interviewing General Bishop, but how times have changed. Very good friend of mine, again, anecdotal story, was served in West Point, and this would have been in 1984 or 1985. Mm-hmm. And he told me a story that I've never forgotten, and that is, he said that if the head of your platoon comes to you and says, Plebe Johnson, how many black men are in your platoon? The answer to that, the correct answer is, sir, I don't know, sir.
Yeah.
That is what they were taught, to be colorblind. Right. If you gave the answer as to how many blacks were in your platoon, that was the wrong answer, because that means you're paying attention to color. That's what was being treated at West Point in 1985.
Yes. The report that I mentioned, the Military Leadership Diversity Commission report, actually said what we are going to implement will not be colorblind. It's going to be diversity based on percentages. Now, that is such a radical change, and it happened very quietly. We were on top of it, and a few other organizations are involved now. But it does have consequences. And let me explain one more thing. On the Presidential Commission on which I served, the first thing we did was to decide how would we make our decisions? How would we decide on every issue before us? We dealt with all branches of the service, a wide range of issues. We visited bases all over the country. And the first thing we did was vote for this, a statement. Equal opportunity in the military is important. But if there is a conflict between equal opportunity and the needs of the military must come first. That was, you have no idea how controversial that statement was, because people who wanted women in the infantry knew that was the ballgame. Because if you want women in the infantry, you're saying equal opportunity is more important. If you say equal opportunity is more important, then why not have transgenders in the military? Why not have the whole range of social agenda items? It all starts with the priorities that are followed. And that's why it's right there on our webpage. Our mission statement is, we support readiness, sound priorities. That means the needs of the military must come first.
And so describe for us the state of the military now as far as getting promotions and rising to the level of general and so on. In order to become a general these days, you probably have to have demonstrated your commitment to equity, diversity, and to all these things that you're talking about, right?
That is the criteria now. Some people have said we need to have women in combat arms and even selective service so that they can get promotions. Here's something you probably were not aware of, and I followed this issue for decades. Women have been promoted at rates equal to or faster than men. It's been that way for decades, and it still is. We don't need to have women in the infantry in order to have some who aspire to be generals to become generals and admirals. A lot of women, when they get to a certain point in their career, they decide families come first. And that's the way it is in private industry too, isn't it? So the fact that we don't have equal numbers of female generals and admirals, that's not a sign that the military discriminates against women. It just means that women make choices on their own, and the military shouldn't be trying to force something different on them just to please some woke activists who say, well, why don't you have 25% or 50%? You see how priorities really are important.
Hmm. Okay, let's turn to the transgender issue. So the current state is that there's zero restrictions on transgender. And by the way, we did a deep dive on this show on the whole issue of transgender and gender dysphoria. That's what it is. It is a
Right.
psychological disorder called gender dysphoria. And the military precludes people from serving with all kinds of disorders. And gender dysphoria would appear to be one of those types of disorders. But of course, you've got this movement, LGBT activists, that want to say that, well, no, it's not a disorder. We don't want to call it a disorder, even though it's been diagnosed as a disorder by, for decades. Tell us, first of all, what is the current state for transgender in the military?
Well, I'm going to go back a few years first. In the Obama administration, at the tail end of the administration, the decision was made to include transgenders in the military. When the new administration came in, Donald Trump issued some tweets. He said, no, that's not going to happen. But that's not what changed policy. There was a 6-month study of what happened under the Obama administration. And what was found was 300% increases in medical visits, in medical costs for those who sought treatment for gender dysphoria. These are just two factoids that were presented to President Trump. And the Secretary of Defense at the time, James Mattis, suggested, well, we need to have a policy that focuses on gender dysphoria. And that is exactly what the president did. The policy is not a ban on transgenders in the military. It does have restrictions, or it used to. And frankly, I think that policy would have been upheld by the US Supreme Court. It was on its way to the Supreme Court when Joe Biden got elected. So it was either, I think 5 days after he took office, he signed an executive order, said, no, we're going to go back to the Biden years.
So to be clear,
Right.
hold on. So to be clear, under the Trump policy, it was not an absolute ban on transgender. It just limited their service depending on what their particular circumstances were.
Yes, if they were stable for 18 months and if they served in their biological sex. You see, some people do serve in their biological sex, even if they have feelings that might be tending toward gender dysphoria. And that was the policy. In fact, the advocacy groups at the time said you have people with gender dysphoria and you have transgenders who do not have gender dysphoria. Now, it's a very fine point, and the thorough job that was done by the panel of experts under the direction of President Trump and at the time the Secretary of Defense, James Mattis. It was really a solid report. That's why I say it was on its way to being upheld as constitutional by the Supreme Court. It was implemented, but in comes the new administration, and they've thrown that out. And they have returned now to the Obama administration policies, which are just now starting to take effect. What does this mean? Well, the first group of people to be hurt will be women. Privacy is an issue because biological males will be required and allowed to use private facilities that used to be reserved for only women. We have athletic teams in the military also starting with the military service academies. We haven't seen it yet, but if we start seeing competitors who are biologically different on the women's teams, that's going to be extremely controversial. That's an issue that's probably we'll see coming up down the road. But the primary objection is, why are we doing this? They're doing it for reasons of equal opportunity, regardless of the cost, regardless of the impact, regardless of the lost time for medical visits, the cost for surgeries. The demand, and we predicted this, the demand has already been made that these so-called benefits surgeries to change, well, they don't change sex, but they do mutilate bodies. When you remove healthy body parts, what do you call that?
So under the new plan, I could join the military with gender dysphoria.
Yes.
And I could get a sex change operation while a member of the military, paid for by the government.
That is the rule right now. I'm not even aware that there might be some minor restriction in terms of timing. But once you're in the military and you announce that you want to be treated for gender dysphoria, or you want to transition to the opposite sex, several things happen. You can have as long as a full year off for what is called experience, real life experience, RLE. This is time away so that you can experiment with living as a persona of a person of the opposite sex. Then the decision is made whether or not to seek hormone treatments, which are very costly, lifelong, and irreversible in many cases. And not the majority, but in some cases, surgeries are sought to remove healthy body parts. Yes, the Pentagon will finance that. The Veterans Administration is going to be forced to cover these kinds of surgeries. It's going to be very costly. And the demands have already been made, as we predicted, to extend all of those costs to dependents, including children. Now I hope people understand just how far reaching this policy is. Now, I hasten to add, transgenderism, this has got to be really tough, to be so confused about your sexuality that you seek this kind of treatment. You have compassion for people who feel that way. These people deserve competent medical care. But here's the problem. When the medical care only goes in one direction, that's not fair to the patient. If someone says you have a heart condition, so you need to go and have a heart transplant, well, excuse me, I think I need a second opinion. It's the same way with psychological conditions. People should have the kind of medical care that gives all of the options so that people are fully informed of the risks, the negative parts of it. But right now, the so-called medical treatment only goes in one direction, and
I can explain that. That's because LGBT activists have hijacked this issue and the entire medical community, including the American Academy of Pediatrics, to say that you are born this way. And if you don't believe born this way, then you're cast out and canceled. You can't get promoted anywhere.
There is a contradiction there, isn't it? I mean, they'll say you're born this way with regard to the LGB, lesbian, gay, bisexual. But when it comes to transgenders, oh no, we're different. You can change your biological sex. The truth is, because of human DNA and what science tells us about human DNA, your biological sex is determined even before birth. You can change your appearance. You can change your persona. You can change a lot of things, your hairstyle, your clothing. You can do all of these things, but it still doesn't change your biological sex. Now, how does this affect the doctors and nurses in the military? This is one of the more serious results of the new policy. Doctors and nurses will not have the option to decline to perform these kinds of surgeries or treatments. If they do, they will put their career at risk. This is official policy now. Again, it's unfair to the patients, it's unfair to their families, it's unfair to those doctors and nurses, and then you get into chaplains and religious convictions.
So just to be clear, just put a fine point on it, and then I want to move on to the next topic. In military hospitals, they are performing gender reassignment surgeries.
Yes, reportedly. That's right. And if they can't do them in military hospitals, then they're being done elsewhere. It's an elaborate system for these referrals. It's going on. It's hard to get the data, but the Trump administration's report said that in some units, Even maintenance budgets were pressed because they had people who had to travel to other cities to get transgender hormones and treatments and all the rest. So all of these costs were indeed considerable, and there was no justification for it any more than any other psychological condition should be accommodated no matter what the cost is. You see, because it's considered a special class, anyone involved with the LGBT movement, transgenders, the Pentagon now is fully supportive of this agenda. LGBT Pride Month in June was celebrated in the Pentagon, not during the Trump years, but certainly in the Biden administration. It is a change in priorities. And in the next elections, the next two, people are going to have to decide, do they want to continue this or do they want to make a change?
What about gays in the military? What is your position on that?
Well, we fought the repeal of the law in 2010. As I mentioned, the law that was passed in 1993 did withstand constitutional challenge for quite a few years. That policy,
93 was don't ask, don't tell.
no, it was a law that said homosexuals were not eligible to serve in the armed forces. Don't ask, don't tell was an administrative policy. It was put in place by Bill Clinton. It made no sense. We did not support don't ask, don't tell, but people use the catchphrase to describe the actual law. Section 654, Title 10, nobody remembers that. But the law was constitutional because it was based on military necessity. But when you change it to something else, then you invite a whole host of things that we predicted, but at that time the administration denied.
Okay, so sorry, let's just take, like, because a lot of my listeners, aren't up on this as much as you are. So let's walk them through this. So you're saying that the Supreme Court upheld a law banning homosexuals from serving in the military.
Yes.
Right.
Several times.
And it was based on military readiness. What was the primary argument in favor of the ban?
There were actually 14 different findings. Things like the military is unique. It must deploy on short notice. People live in close quarters. Unit cohesion and morale are important. I'm just saying this from memory.
Mm-hmm.
All of those findings remain sound to this day. In fact, a Pentagon official was asked, "Are all these findings still valid?" He said, "Yes."
Now let me push back on one thing.
Why are you asking for a change? Because the Obama administration wanted to change it. That's it.
A lot of people have made the comparison between the ban on gays to a ban on blacks, or saying that blacks could not serve in the same platoon and so on as gays. So dispel that for people.
Yes, I did. No comparison, because when Harry Truman signed the executive order to end discrimination and prejudice in the military, it was done for two reasons: the needs of the military and, of course, equal opportunity. And that is the way it can be done. It should be done. It was done before the civilian world. But the law regarding gays in the military, there were a number of promises made, and we made some predictions, all of which have come true. The promise was made there wouldn't be same-sex marriages. There wouldn't be same-sex benefits. The denial was made that transgenders would ever come into the picture, that religious liberty would not be affected. We warned that all of those promises would not be held. And of course, within weeks, we were proven right. But many members of Congress were misled. There's also a problem of sexual misconduct. And I'm sorry to report that the issue of sexual misconduct is not involving women alone. The rates for both women and men have escalated year after year after year. We don't know exactly how it is happening and who is doing this with regard to men. But it's getting to the point now where even in Congress, they're starting to take notice. It's the kind of thing that really does need scrutiny, and more scrutiny. You mentioned your friend, or maybe it was a family member in the Navy. The Navy's been the worst. There was on the USS Ronald Reagan several years ago, a transgender person, actually a person who was identified as gay. He used to do drag dancing, and he may still be, I don't know, on the carrier Ronald Reagan. It was a strip dance, a drag queen strip dance on a warship, USS Ronald Reagan. And the Navy not only condoned it, it was written up with pictures in Navy Times, and nobody said anything about it. That was during the Trump administration. I know they were concerned about it, but they didn't have the right people at the Pentagon to make a change. So I'll tell you that the Navy's been the worst, but all of the services have dabbled in social engineering to various degrees. And right now, there's a serious lack of leadership for sound policy.
So, but wasn't the argument about unit cohesion made when blacks had to serve in separate platoons? And that argument's now being made as far as, well, gays can't serve with straights in the same platoon. There's a unit cohesiveness issue. And certainly nobody would argue today that blacks serving together with whites affects
Allow me to
unit
add
cohesion.
this.
Yeah.
The discrimination, the prejudice that occurred before the Truman executive order was based on irrational prejudice. There was nothing rational about it. It wasn't real. And that's why when the military was ordered to eliminate discrimination, it not only worked, we saw minority soldiers and aviators fighting in that war and with distinction and respect. It's been said that the military is the only institution where minority members routinely boss white personnel around. It's because they're good, and it's because we needed them in our military, and we still do. That the military has been way ahead of the civilian world in dealing with issues of racial discrimination. When you talk about LGBT issues, you're talking about sex. You're talking about sexual feelings, and you're talking about, is this really a good idea for morale? Is it good for women? Is it good for men? Is it good for discipline and morale? That is so important. These are the intangibles. There really is no case for the inclusion and extension of repeal of that law into where we're headed right now. Certainly, the issues of sexual misconduct are a side effect of the change in the law, but it wasn't only the change in that law.
Well, but wouldn't you have to say the sexual misconduct, you would have to be able to demonstrate that gays engage in sexual misconduct at a higher rate than
no, that's not what that is not what I said. I said the issues of sexual misconduct have escalated every year. We don't know the exact reasons why. We just know there is a problem. It does need to be looked at objectively. And we know that men are being victimized at a higher, actually, I think the numbers are higher among men because there's more men in the military. And it's an issue that is drawing attention in Congress.
But it's saying on the gay,
every person who is gay in the military is likely to attack someone else. And no, that's not what I said. That certainly is not what I intended to say. And we don't know to what extent these kinds of issues are causing these kinds of problems.
Mm-hmm. But let me just ask one more question on the gay issue, and then we'll move on to the next one. I mean, society does change. I mean, the acceptance of gays has become far, far greater during my lifetime. I mean, I never thought I'd see gay marriage, and that happened so swiftly and so on. And just like perhaps whites and blacks weren't as comfortable mixing back in the 40s, and now it's commonplace. Kind of the same things going on with straight and gay. More gays are out of the closet. Everybody now has a family member or a friend that's out of the closet gay. We're interacting with each other more. We're becoming more comfortable with it. So that whole unit cohesion thing, where actually sleeping next to a gay person, having them shower next to you, having them use the same bathroom, so on. I just think society is changing on that, and that doesn't seem to be affecting cohesion as much.
Society has changed to the point that women are comfortable with biological men sharing the showers with them.
Okay, that's transgender. I just want to stay on gay for a second, though. Let's stay on gay.
Remember, when
those two lesbians,
when the issue was before Congress, we predicted, although the administration denied, that it would lead directly to the transgender issue and a host of other things that were difficult to predict, but we knew that there would be issues. Now, in some cases, not a problem, but in many cases, there is a problem. And religious freedom is affected also because chaplains have been told and disciplined, in some cases dismissed, for reflecting the values of the institutions that authorize them to be chaplains in the military. So all of these, they all are intertwined. But I don't see that as a personal thing. It's a matter of what are the policymakers doing? Policymakers are to blame here, not the individuals. What are they doing? Why are they doing it? What priorities are they showing? Are they pursuing the kinds of priorities that are problematic? I think that the latter is true, and even more so in this administration than we have seen in previous years.
And so bottom line, what should be the military policy on gays?
I think it's unlikely that the law as it was written in 1993 would be put back in place. I doubt that uh, because, well, it's just not going to happen. But I do think that where the rights of others are impinged upon, when we get into quotas, when we get into saying, well, some people are more special than others, then I think we need to reassess where we're going with this.
Well, by the way, I wouldn't doubt for 2 seconds that there's affirmative action for LGBT in the military right now.
Well, we know there is in the administration. They're always celebrating and putting out news releases about people who are LGBT who are being appointed to rather high level positions in the Pentagon and in the administration. Yes, it has become a diversity factor. It's being overdone. I think people have a certain level of tolerance and friendship that will continue, but I think the way the agenda is being taken to extremes. Again, we predicted this, and we have no idea how far it's going to be taken.
Mhm. Okay, last thing I want to cover is just politicization of the military, which really all these issues, that's exactly what it is. It's politicization of the military, but in particular, politics involving the stand down day that
Yes.
was recently issued. So tell everyone what was stand down day and how did it play out?
Well, the new Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, when he came in, was disturbed about reports that there were some veterans who were involved in the assault on the Capitol on January 6th. He also had a personal experience, a horrible incident when he was a junior officer where someone was killed on the street, a couple actually, a black couple. And it really was something that he was very concerned about when he was just starting in the military. Um, so he called for a worldwide stand down month. A full day would be scheduled at every base around the world. The problem was that the materials that were issued to look at extremism skewed only to one type of extremism, right wing extremism. And we know that in the past, these kinds of right wing groups that are extreme, KKK, those kinds of groups, yeah, they used to be there and they may still be. And that problem does need to be addressed. It has been for decades. But what was missing was, what about the people on the left? What about, you mentioned West Point, this commie cadet, that was the nickname that was attached to him because he had on his cover when he graduated, full uniform, inside his cover it said, communism will win. He had Che Guevara on his chest underneath his uniform. The guy was a total leftist radical and he had mentors at West Point. Now, they're not looking at that kind of extremism, and I have a problem with that. The Antifa group, the extreme elements of Black Lives Matter, who have exploited people who want to seriously protest, and they have the right to protest the death of George Floyd or anything else. But the BLM organization itself, the leaders are self identified Marxist. So if you have a stand down day and you don't look at those kinds of issues, those extremists, then you create a morale problem. Enter Senator Tom Cotton. He has legislation to end critical race theory teachings in the military, starting with the academies. This legislation, unfortunately, is necessary because the Pentagon is looking at this issue only in terms of one type of extremism, and they're overlooking the extreme elements of critical race theory and what it means, how destructive it is to sit people down, black and white together, and have one group say that group over there is racist because of their skin color. And then they're all supposed to go out and fight a war together. Talk about a blow to unit cohesion. I can't imagine anything more destructive than that. And yet, this administration eliminated the Trump administration's first executive order to get rid of CRT in the military. They want it in the military. And then they've been issuing several executive orders since then.
So to be clear, was that one of the, Biden signed a ton of executive orders essentially on his first day. Was that one of them,
Yes.
overturning Trump's ban?
On the first day, he overturned the executive order banning CRT. He also got rid of the 1776 Commission, the one that wants honest history to include teaching about what happened with slavery and how did we end slavery. This was a commission headed by Larry Arnn of Hillsdale. Distinguished historians were part of this commission. They issued a report. They took that report down from the White House website. They abolished the commission. They are still going to continue in a private capacity. And then several days later, there was another executive order mandating critical race theory in military institutions. It gets confusing because there were so many. I've written about them. You can look it up on my webpage, cmrlink.org. But this administration is quite determined, and this is not an accident. And that's why I say, although we're not a lobbying group, legislation is not our mission. We're a public policy organization, but we write about reasons why something must be done. And it appears that Congress is the only institution that can do something about this before it becomes too late. The legislation that Tom Cotton and Dan Bishop are offering in the current Congress would say things that shouldn't even be controversial. For instance, any race is inherently superior or inferior to any other race. We can't have that kind of teaching. The United States is a fundamentally racist country? No. The Declaration of Independence and the US Constitution are fundamentally racist documents? No, we don't need that. An individual's moral worth is determined by his or her race? No, we shouldn't have that. I could go on. The legislation says we will not teach these kinds of ideas in our military institutions. It deserves support. And that's why many people, even new groups, are popping up to say, we want something done. Now, with the schools, parents are out there. The Congress doesn't really have a mandate to order local schools what to do. We've been through Common Core, and we know how that didn't work out, and people fought against Washington mandated Common Core provisions. But when it comes to the military, Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution says Congress makes the rules. So that's why the current National Defense Authorization Act, certainly we hope that this kind of legislation will be put into that bill. Even though it's the Biden administration, it would be a marker. It would give people some legal leg to stand on. And if it doesn't pass, then it will be an issue in the next two elections, the off-year congressional elections, and of course the presidential race.
So for the people who say that, oh, this critical race theory is just made up by the right, this is a fantasy that they like to get worked up. I mean, what better proof that it is real than the fact that the first thing Biden does when he takes office is overturn Trump's ban on CRT. So what does that tell you right there?
The evidence is overwhelming. And I think Senator Cotton and Dan Crenshaw teamed up to set up a whistleblower website. And they've been getting hundreds of statements from people who are not disclosing their identity. These are real people, but they're not disclosing identity for obvious reasons. And they're describing these instructions. They're describing being told, if you're white skin, you stand here. If you're black skin, you stand there. And then there's a social experiment. Well, who gets to dominate who? Who's the oppressor? Who are the oppressed? These are tenets of critical race theory. But when you see the Chief of Naval Operations defending his choice of a book by Ibram X. Kendi, how to be an anti-racist, this is inappropriate. And yet he defended that as a book that should be on Navy reading lists. We saw General Milley say something about, well, because I've read about Marxism doesn't mean I'm a Marxist. Excuse me, General, nobody accused you of being a Marxist. Why are you defending critical race theory, which is derived from Marxist theory? The book written by Matthew Lohmeyer tracks this very well. He goes way back into history and tracks where the history came from. This didn't come out of the blue, and it didn't happen overnight. But now we are seeing it. General Milley needs to do his homework, and he needs to get his priorities straight. Because when you have theories being taught in military institutions, schools, academies, the colleges, the war colleges, what you're going to do is divide people. And you're also telling them they have no right to dissent. If they do, their careers will be ended. He's actually, in effect, forcing out of the military the kind of good, patriotic people that we need. How does this affect recruiting? How do you recruit young people to serve in the military if they're being taught in schools that America is not worth defending? This is alarming. And yet, people are just now beginning to understand it. Here's some good news. The polls are showing strong opposition to critical race theory. I'm amazed at how quickly the American people have come to understand this issue, and they are pushing back. And the first pushback, though, has to start with the military, because quite often the military leads the way for social change, and it can lead the way in the wrong direction. It can be brought back given sound leadership, but it's up to civilians like you and me and everybody to insist on sound policy, sound priorities. This fight has just begun.
Thank you again to our guest, Elaine Donnelly. You can check out everything that she does on her website. Just Google Center for Military Readiness. That's the Center for Military Readiness. Thank you to our producer, Michael Parker. Thank you all for listening. We'll be back soon with another episode of The Hidden Truth Show.
Thank you for listening to The Hidden Truth Show with Jim Breslow. You can find us at hiddentruthshow.com. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Hidden Truth Show. Join us again next week for another episode of Hidden Truth Show with Jim Breslow.